On today's episode of Locked On Wild, could a three-goalie rotation work? We ask Joe Smith of The Athletic.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild. We are your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, and we are your team each and every day. We thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, Joe Smith of The Athletic joins us as we get closer to the start of the NHL season. We'll talk potential for a three-goalie rotation and why that may not be something that works for the Minnesota Wild, as well as some expectations for a few players on the roster as well. My name is Seth Topal, host of Locked On Wild, and as mentioned, we bring Joe Smith in of The Athletic. And Joe, it's been... At some points, it seems like a long summer, but at some other points, it seems like it's just flown by, and we're about 2 weeks out from things really starting to kick up. And so just looking at where the Minnesota Wild are at right now, not a lot changed from last year to this year. But I know one thing that a lot of people are really keen on is what happens with the goalie room. There were rumors that Filip Gustavsson might get traded early on in the offseason. It seemed like those kind of tampered down, and now we go in with Marc-Andre Fleury and Filip Gustavsson, and fans want to see Jesper Wallstedt given a chance as well. How do you see this shaking out, at least in the early part of the season?
Well, good to be on here, obviously, and talking to you. But, I think it's the most intriguing position in the entire team. If you look at last year, below average goaltending. Of course, it wasn't all on Gustavsson and Fleury. Their play in front of them, the penalty kill was bad. So you can't blame it all on the goalies. But if they had average or above average goaltending, you're looking at a pretty close race there for a playoff spot. And so how they handle these goalies in this year is going to be so important. And they're counting on bounce back years from both Fleury and Gustavsson, who will get a majority of the work. But they have added a new wrinkle in a sense of having their number one goalie of the future, Jesper Wallstedt. They're planning on playing him games this year, and how that looks will be kind of decided during camp. But Bill Guerin told me he's like both options are on the table as far as starting the season with him on the roster for a good part of the season, or just picking spots in the schedule. You can have him on the roster and pick up more games. They wanted to give him more looks. He had 3 games last year, but how that is kind of manipulated remains to be seen. But they feel that he will not only benefit from playing more games, but practicing at the NHL level, the speed, competition, and the shots, all that kind of stuff, where even if he's not playing very much, that he will still have value. But it's a very tricky position because you have a guy who's going to be your future number one goaltender, and you want to treat him right. You want to make sure that he believes he's an NHL goalie. He wants to be there, as opposed to going to a third full season in the AHL. But what's better for him? Is it better to play 65 games in the AHL and be the man and get spot starts still in the NHL and be on the team full time the following year, or is it give him extended look? So something I definitely explored this summer is kind of asking questions to other goalies who've been through it on how you handle it.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating. And for those that haven't had a chance to read it, I encourage you to head to The Athletic and check it out, because you talked to quite a few goalies that have been in three-goalie rotations before, and they pretty much to a T all said it's not as easy as it sounds, because you've got the older goalie who often is the one that gets the fewest starts and is more of the veteran capacity. But in some of Bill Guerin's comments this offseason, he's still of the belief that Marc-Andre Fleury has a lot to contribute to this team. And so you almost are putting Jesper in that short end starts role. It's going to be fascinating to see how this potentially plays out if they do truly go that route.
Yeah, you're right. I talked to Ryan Miller and Marty Biron and Dwayne Rolson, some guys who have A, some guys who played into their 40s, and B, some guys who played into 3-goalie rotation. And it was put to be best this way is like when you try to make 3 guys happy, no one's happy, just because it's hard to get that right mix. I mean, Bill Guerin said, it's realistic that Fleury could play 40 games like he did last year, or early 40s, which means that in theory, if Gustavsson does still play well or is not injured, he could be in the 25-30 range, right? And then you have the whatever there's left for Wallstedt if that indeed falls in line. So, but the other cases where they've had the third goalie being more of a veteran type, I mean, they had it work sometimes a little bit in, I think, Buffalo recently, in Montreal to a certain extent in short spurts. But I think with, like, Craig Anderson was a third goalie, like, in his career in Buffalo, but he knew his role. He knew he was okay with being in that spot and just playing at certain times. But it's different when your third goalie is a guy that you want to groom to be, the guy of the future. And then the point that Ryan Miller made to me is you want your young guy to learn what it's like to have a net before he goes in the net full time. And I think Jesper has been, handled it really well the last couple of years. I sat down with him last year in Iowa for a really big story, and I met his family at his debut and kind of went over all this kind of different things. I think he has a mental makeup that he could probably handle this kind of thing. I think he wants to play. He wants to play more than whatever spot starts he will get. I think he has that maturity to handle that tough position, but you want to put him in that position in the first place. But I think for me, you mentioned Gustavsson, a reason why probably either the goalie market wasn't there for him because it was kind of a lot of goalie trades early in the offseason. There wasn't really much more need unless there's an injury that comes about for that. But also, you're putting a lot of hope or faith in Fleury in his 40-year-old season and Wallstedt, who's played 83 NHL games. If you do trade Gustavsson, right, those are your 2 guys, and you rarely have a situation where guys who are 40 and over play 40-plus games, or guys who are 22 and under play 40-plus games. So I think it does make sense to have Gustavsson and Fleury here. It's just a matter of how can they smartly incorporate Wallstedt into the season and make sure that all goaltenders are sharp and playing well.
And ultimately, Joe, my thoughts over the offseason have kind of shifted towards, we know Fleury is going to be retiring once the season is done. And would it have maybe benefited Jesper to have that second spot by moving Gustavsson? Maybe, but I feel like it also is a pretty big risk to then go into next season with only having Jesper in the goalie room and having to figure out, like, how do we guide a young goalie through a season in which he's not going to really have a lot of protection? And so I'm wondering if maybe some of the thinking from the Minnesota Wild's perspective is it'd be great to have Gus here next year to be somebody that can take a bulk of those starts if Jesper needs breaks at points during the season, as opposed to just kind of throwing him to the wolves.
And he has under contract for one more season, so it kind of times out perfectly where next year, the 25-26 season, if that Gustavsson does stay here and let's say Wallstedt takes over that 1A role versus 1B, and they're kind of more of a tandem with Gustavsson, then he's on a pretty good deal. I think it could work that way versus trying to go on the market and find a veteran backup. He already knows Gustavsson. He gets along well with them. They have good chemistry. So, he, aside from not having a market for him this offseason, it doesn't hurt to have a goalie under control that they're saying what they believe is that maybe he is not nearly as good as he was maybe 2 years ago when he was number 3 in goals against average. Like, that's not the expectation you need to have, but he's better than the guy was last year,
Yeah.
So he's somewhere in the middle. And I do believe he's, got a lot in him. I think he still has a chance to be a really good goaltender and number 1 goaltender in this league. I think it takes certain guys longer. And I think for him, it's just making sure he's physically in shape and can handle the rigors of a season. But, he had a pretty long stretch there in that 2 seasons ago where he played really, really good hockey. So there's that potential there. And so if they can get him unlocked into that more like that version of Gustavsson this year, you have a quality competition between him and Fleury. Let the guy who has more better performance have the net, and then obviously find a way to squeeze Wallstedt in a condensed schedule to get him. I mean, if he gets 10 plus starts, I think that's a win.
Yeah, I definitely agree. We will continue our discussion with Joe Smith of The Athletic, taking a look at some of the young players we hope to see a lot of this season and more as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wilds after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to check out our bonus episode coming for you later this afternoon. Isha Jerome of the Soda Pod joining us to preview the Pacific Division as we start to go division by division leading up to the start of the season. We'll rank them, talk about the teams that are legit contenders and the other guys. So make sure to tune in for that coming up later today. But let's get back to the discussion with Joe Smith of The Athletic. We're talking to Joe Smith of The Athletic as we gear up for the Minnesota Wild season, which is just a few weeks away. Joe, I want to switch gears and talk about some of the young players that we're excited to see this year. Obviously, Marat Khusnutdinov got a nice sample with the Wild last year, 16 games. Saw Liam Ohgren for 4 games down the stretch as well. The roster is pretty crowded with a lot of pieces from last year's team. There were a couple of moves made to add new pieces to that mix. But where do you expect to see both Khusnutdinov and Ohgren? I know a lot of this is going to be decided in training camp, but at this point, what are you thinking for Khusnutdinov? Is he pretty penciled in as a third line guy, or could you see him in a fourth line role too? Where are you thinking there?
I think either a third or fourth line center. Depends on how they slot it. If they go with the Hartman, Zuccarello, Kaprizov, and then they have Ek, Boldy, and I think potentially Ohgren or Johansson there, and then your third line is Rossi, then it'd have to be Khusnutdinov in the fourth line, right? And I think they saw some growth there. A lot of things had to go on off the ice too. Him to accustomed to life in North America and playing here, and Kirill was terrific as a mentor for that purposes. Very responsible defensively, a really strong forechecker for his size. 1 draws, which everybody in the stands at XL Energy Center went crazy for. But I think they see a little more. They see that he has more potential. Not saying he's going to be a huge scorer, but he can create more offensively or can be more assertive, aggressive that way. But I think if he's a guy you can play on your fourth line, your penalty kill, and which needs a lot of work, maybe different personnel this season, then I think that'd be a good role for him.
You mentioned Ohgren potentially as one of those second line guys, depending on how things shake out with that top line. A guy who really, I think, brings an intriguing skill set to this roster, some size and scoring ability. What is the expectation level for Ohgren for this season as we draw closer?
Well, he definitely impressed late last season. He earned John Hines' trust pretty quickly, which isn't easy to do as a rookie player. Like, I don't think he anticipated playing in the NHL last year. I think he thought about going to Iowa and then maybe finishing there and that kind of thing. But they liked him there and they brought him in, and he wasn't, the moment wasn't too big for him, right? He scored his first NHL goal and he played well defensively, and he has the profile with his size and his NHL caliber shot to play in the top 6. And I think if you're the Wild, you give him every single chance in preseason to play a lot of games and show he can do that. Play him in a game with Boldy and Ek, which I think would be a really good mix for them. So But what that I think Bill Guerin has said he really likes about him is he can play all four lines. He's a guy not every guy can play the second line and a fourth line. Like you wouldn't ideally have a Riley Heidt on the fourth line, or some guys wouldn't be great fits there. But Ohgren offers the flexibility, which coaches love, to be able to move up and down if need be. But I think if you're going into this year and you don't want to just hand Marcus Johansson that second line winger spot. Of course, if he has a bounce back year and a contract year, then he earns it. He's got that pedigree. But why not have Ohgren push for a place there? See if that chemistry works. If not, he can fit second, third, fourth line. Winger in theory. So, but I would be surprised if he's not on opening night roster.
Another guy that you mentioned, Riley Heidt, who brings just a ton of skill that this team I think could really use. But again, roster looks a little crowded, and so what are the chances that he makes this roster? It would take, I feel like, a really impressive preseason to be in consideration. But it feels like the closer we get to the season, Riley Heidt is a guy who may impact more next season and beyond, as opposed to a guy who is in the mix this year.
Yeah, I think, they went in with the idea going into the summer, they give him every chance to make the team. And I think maybe that was the idea. If they would have moved somebody, might have created more of a spot for him. And I think he will get a chance to show in camp a lot of preseason reps. He's already here in Minnesota in formal skates, working out with the guys. So the problem I think they have here is, let's say he has an impressive camp and shows he can play, and you can give him a 9-game tryout before sending him back to junior. Where's the cap space going to come from to have him on there? If you have Wallstedt on the team, that you're down to like about $500,000 in cap space, and then he requires more than that. So I think it would be smart if the Wild do think he's ready for the NHL, or at least ready for that tryout purposes, to give him that, the first few games or whatever. That would mean that Wallstedt didn't be on the roster, at least not yet. But you want to see him play NHL games. Both give him that carrot of knowing what it takes to play in the NHL and how much you have to work on. You can give him the 9-game tryout. If you're not ready, loan him to the World Juniors, right? In the winter, if he makes the World Junior team for Canada, and then he can kind of be an impact player the following year, or just turn pro after that. So he's an intriguing guy. He has NHL mindset or hockey sense. He watches Kane and Kucherov. He really studied those guys, and he plays really strong defensively for a center. He wanted to be on the PK last year. He invited that from his coach as junior, which is not always something star players in that league, top scorer in the league, wants to do. So a lot of things that impressed the Wild, and now I think it's up to him to show it in the prospect showcase next week, and also in the camp, if he can be some guys like Braden Point in Tampa. He forced their hand, like, okay, this guy absolutely needs to be on this team, and it would look bad to everybody else if we saw what he did and all of a sudden he's not here. So players make those decisions for the management in a lot of cases.
Final one for you here, Joe, today, and we appreciate the time here on the show. Bill Guerin has talked about the need for particular players on this roster to play better this upcoming season, and it's no secret that guys like Freddie Gaudreau, Marcus Johansson just had seasons that left a lot of fans wanting more from those guys, and especially in Gaudreau's case. He's a 14 and a 19 goal scorer the last couple of seasons, and his production dips down to 5 this past year. What do you like the chances for those guys to kind of find their previous form, or is this going to be a couple of instances in which we see what Bill Guerin talked about at the end of the season, of these young players waiting for spots to be opened by players that don't necessarily pull their weight?
Well, I think it's a mixture of both in a sense. I do think there are guys that are primed for a bounce back. I think Gaudreau was never really healthy last year. The hit by Ryan Reeves in Game 3, I think, really hurt him. And he plays through a lot, and other things were bothering him. And then obviously mentally, the relationship with Dean Evason, he got fired. There's a certain sense of guilt that some players felt, including him. So I think he's a very extremely positive player from a mindset point of view, but I think last year was hard on him. So maybe with a refreshed summer, obviously last year he also had a newborn, so dealing with that as well. But I think he's a guy, you don't need to have 30 goals. You need, if he scores 15 goals or 14 goals, that's great. But if he could be more effective even on the PK and play with a little more speed, he's a very useful, versatile player. So, and does Ryan Hartman need to score 32 goals? No, but if he can, put his head on a swivel, not play, not get suspended or not get those kind of penalties, and play with the right edge, he has the shot and he has the ability to play with Kaprizov and Zuccarello. That thickens your lineup a little bit by not having Kaprizov, Boldy, and Ek together. So all these guys, if they do a little bit more, they're just counting. Spurgeon will maybe score his 10 goals. That's in their 10 goals that they didn't have last year. So like all these guys kind of stepping in a little bit can help them get back to where they want to be. The problem is the division got a lot better. So even if they do bounce back and play well, they're going to be in a dogfight till the end for a playoff spot.
Joe, we appreciate the time here today. For Wild fans who want to read more on the Minnesota Wild, make sure to head to The Athletic. And you and Michael Russo both just keeping it on lock here as we get closer. Appreciate the time, Joe. We'll have to do this again as we get closer to the season and then during as well. And enjoy these last couple of weeks before we really get things fired up.
Thanks for having me. Love joining the podcast here. And I have my own podcast too, Fellowship of the Rink, which is available on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube, and a lot of fun interviews with Wild, Gophers, and NHL people there. So yeah, it's fun being part of the podcast group here in Minnesota. A lot of people love hockey and can't get enough of it. So it's good for people like us who love talking about it.
Big thank you to Joe Smith for joining the show today to take a look at the goalie rotation possibility, as well as some young players that we hope to see a lot of this year, and others that may rebound as well. When we come back, we're going to finish today's episode by taking a look at a former Minnesota Wild defenseman who is calling it quits and why this is likely not the last time that we hear Alex Goligoski's name in the NHL. That's all coming up after this here on today's episode of Locked On Wild. We are your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is also brought to you by Game Time. Folks, college football, the NFL, and the playoff push for Major League Baseball all going on right now, and there is no better time to see your favorite teams in action than in this glorious fall weather. Game Time can help make the ticket buying experience as stress-free as possible, and Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. And once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder to you that we've got another episode coming to finish off the day, finish off your week, as Isha Jerome joined us for a nice big Pacific Division preview. So that's coming up later here today as well. A couple episodes for you. If you've got weekend plans and are headed out of town, we got a couple of good ones for you here to finish off the week. News from this week. And since we had Joe Smith on the show, I will highlight the article that he wrote for The Athletic. Alex Goligoski, a career come full circle in Minnesota and a dream retirement gift. Goligoski officially announced his retirement from the NHL, and a player that Minnesota Wild fans got a chance to see with one really good season here in Minnesota. Before a couple of seasons in which Father Time just got the last laugh, and this is something that happens to every player throughout the course of their career. Is that at some point it just becomes time to hang it up. And so Goligoski officially retires with 1,078 career games under his belt, 475 career points, and a career that spans 17 different seasons. Now, you look at what he did in his first season with the Minnesota Wilds. If I recall correctly, he was paired predominantly with Jared Spurgeon. in that first season. Played in 72 games. He had 30 points. He was also plus 41 on the season, but it was at that point that age started to really show through. And after that, he was more of a part-time player over the final 2 years of his NHL career. Had one of the all-time goals in which the game that he was honored for his 1,000th career game against the Carolina Hurricanes. He scored the game-winning goal in overtime and propelled the Wild to a win that they desperately needed at that point. But I remember Goligoski talking after that game about, this being a difficult stretch for him during his career, but he never, at least that I heard, he never was a player that made it about him, even when he didn't play as much over the last 2 seasons as he probably would have liked. Never made it about him, never complained publicly. He was in it to do whatever he could to help the team win games. And if that meant having other players play instead of him, he was all for that. And so even though he didn't necessarily get to write the ending he wanted, felt like it was time to call it quits. And why I said that it wouldn't surprise me if we see him again is because there was a survey done by The Athletic, if I recall correctly, and I talked about this on the Soda Pod too. So if you heard that with Isha, don't feel like you've got deja vu. But I just thought it was worth mentioning as well. There was a survey done on The Athletic by Minnesota Wild players for particular categories. And one of the categories was player most likely to end up in the front office. And Alex Goligoski was the runaway winner. And it just, with how he has found a way to make it through 17 different seasons at the NHL level, he's seen a lot. And that, I think, would be valuable for some team in the NHL to have that experience and to be able to, maybe it be in a player development role, assistant to the general manager, special advisor. There are no shortage of roles for former players in NHL front offices. And I feel like Goligoski, if he wants it, would be a perfect fit for one of those types of roles once he's ready to come back to the game. Now, if he doesn't want to come back, that's perfectly fine. He's earned the right for some family time and an ability to just kind of figure out what comes next. Played, obviously, with Pittsburgh. He played with Dallas. He played with Arizona, played with the Minnesota Wild. No shortage of stops for a career that started in the 2007-2008 season and led to couple of instances in which he was able to be part of some deep playoff runs. Obviously, the thing that he will be known for here in Minnesota was, and I think a lot of this was agreed upon before that second deal was ever signed. He had the first year here that was good. And I think a lot of people would have preferred that just you leave it at that and be done. But the 2-year extension that he signed to finish out here in Minnesota, obviously the numbers just weren't the same as the first year he had here. But a good guy, good teammate, and somebody who I think certainly sets up for a career in the front office if he wants it. But Joe mentions too that Goligoski mentioned that the coaching staff and John Hines were good in terms of communicating with him, but the reality of the situation down the stretch was there wasn't a ton of opportunities for him to get into the lineup with where he was at in his career. So best of luck to Goligoski in retirement, and one of the players that got the chance to say that he finished out at home and finished out his career where his young hockey career got started. Obviously, he was a member of the University of Minnesota, and got his chance to end his chapter where a lot of it started. So that's what we got for your show here today. Again, big thank you to Joe Smith for joining to get us a little closer to the start of the season. We'll have Joe on again as we get closer, as we will with many of the Minnesota Wild media regulars as we get geared up here for the season to start in the next few weeks. Make sure to hit that like button before you hop out for today, and make sure to subscribe if you have not already. We just crossed the 2,800 subscriber threshold, so thank you to everybody that has already subscribed and continues to make Locked On Wild as big of a hit as it continues to be. Make sure to tune in for our second episode of the day coming up later. And other than that, we will catch you on Sunday night at 8 p.m. with Denny for the live show. So make sure to tune in for that coming up at 8 p.m. on Sunday. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we'll be back with you on the next episode of Locked On Wild, keeping you up to date with all things Minnesota Wild every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.